The FBI's search of Mar-a-Lago to recover classified documents is just the latest data point in a long line of Trump's security lapses that the New York Times today notes has led to a poisoned relationship between Trump and the keepers of U.S. secrets. This piece reads like a low-light reel of national security risks during the Trump years, like the time when Trump hosted the then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at Mar-a-Lago and North Korea launched a ballistic missile during their dinner. Trump turned the dining room into a makeshift situation room in full view of all the waitstaff and guests. One diner seated nearby posted the whole thing on Facebook. Or the time when Trump revealed classified intelligence to Russian officials in the Oval Office. That disclosure prompted concern that U.S. intelligence officials, they tried to yank a highly placed source out of the Kremlin. And there was that time when Trump was so impressed with a classified photo of an explosion at a space launch facility in Iran that he wanted to post it to Twitter. He proceeded to do just that against the advice of aides. He typed up a snarky caption to stick it to Iran and hit send, sharing it with his 33 million followers. These high-risk blunders happen so frequently that U.S. intelligence officials reportedly started withholding sensitive information from the president because they had so little confidence that it wouldn't be leaked or compromised. And that's when they could actually get Trump to focus at all during daily briefings. We learned from the Times that Trump's attention span was notoriously short. He rarely read intelligence reports, but he really liked graphs, charts, and tables. But that stopped altogether on January 6th. He didn't show up for his briefing that day, apparently too busy with his rally in his effort to overturn the 2020 election. He never received another presidential briefing in the final month of his presidency. Of course, it goes without saying that none of this is how intelligence is supposed to be handled and how these briefings are supposed to go. My next guest knows all about this process from his time at the CIA, where he worked as a daily intelligence briefer for both President Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. He was also tasked with briefing FBI Director Robert Mueller and Attorney General John Ashcroft on intelligence materials each morning. So what does he make of the news that a search warrant unveiled today shows that FBI agents removed 11 sets of classified documents from the president's Florida home on Monday? Joining us now is David Priess, former CIA intelligence officer, now publisher of Lawfare and author of the President's Book of Secrets, about the relationship between the president and top secret intelligence. Mr. Priess, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
What's your sense of it? I guess for those of us who don't deal with top secret or classified or highly classified or compartmented information, we're not quite sure about the fact that you would definitely know this is classified or this is not supposed to leave the White House or this is not supposed to be shared with other people. All the experts I've talked to, like you, say this isn't a gray area. People know when they're getting top secret or classified or compartmented information.
That's right. There can be some confusion about it in limited cases in a briefing when somebody is having a conversation between an intelligence officer and a policymaker and not emphasizing what parts are classified and what parts aren't. That's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about material, presumably most of them documents. Documents that are classified have classification markings. That's the confidential, secret, or top secret, depending on the level of damage to U.S. national security if they're compromised. And then often they also have controls or limits even within that classification range. That is something like the SCI that you've seen references to today that talk about sensitive compartmented information so that not everybody who has a top secret clearance can see every bit of information that's in a compartment. Those markings are on the documents. Even the president's daily brief itself, which is a highly stylized production, often in a fancy leather notebook, still has top secret stamped on it just to make sure that you know it's classified. There's no area for confusion here.
Who controls the controls and the limits on the various types of documents? And I'm asking you this obviously in the context that there are some people arguing, who have made the case that the president declassified the information. He's also made references to that. What's that process, and would it have had to have happened? Is it something the president can just say he did?
The president cannot retroactively declassify something from when he was president. So let's take that off the table. If the argument is, well, I declassified these while I was president and I just didn't tell anyone, that does not hold up. courts have actually shown you can't do that. There must be some kind of process or procedure to show that this is declassified. Plus, when that happens, those documents no longer have those huge markings on them. Those are crossed out, and there's a declassification stamp put on the actual document so that there will be no confusion about it whatsoever. It states when it was declassified so that it can be seen publicly. Presumably, that's not the case here. Maybe that's part of what the search and seizure warrant is for, to determine if, in fact, all of these documents, and there's quite a few here, if all of these documents, in fact, were properly declassified and have all of those declassification markings on them, maybe there's less of an issue here. I say less of an issue because there's still an issue under the Presidential Records Act that if these are presidential records,
still shouldn't have been
Trump shouldn't have them at all. Those are the property of the U.S. government as soon as he is out of office. But I very much doubt that we're going to find that these presumably dozens or even hundreds of previously classified documents were properly declassified at the time.
But that is an entirely provable matter, right? That's the kind of thing that if Donald Trump says he did it, there should be an evidence trail that he can produce that would answer that question and satisfy either the court or the Justice Department, one way or the other.
Absolutely. That is not something that should be a mystery. That's something that should be a resolvable question of fact. Were they declassified while he was president, or were they not? If they were declassified while he was president, that should be visible on the documents, as I mentioned. But there also should be other government documents backing this up to show the process of declassification. It's not just the president waving a magic wand when he feels like it and suddenly secrets aren't secrets anymore. It doesn't work that way.